I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. Suzanne and I are really, really grateful you're here because we know these circumstances are very unusual, and it's just a stressful time. So thanks for being here. First, let me just tell you that all of the links on our particular presentation are active. So you can go to the presentation at the bit.ly address and you can click all the way through it. And we're not going to close it down after the presentation, so you'll still be able to access it after this. I'm Stephanie Macceca, the one on the left. I'm a teacher librarian at Valhalla High School. I'm located in El Cajon, California, which is a bedroom community of San Diego. And my cohorts are Suzanne Sannwald. She's the librarian at West Hills High School. Hey, Suzanne. And also we have with us a moderator who's going to be managing the chat. That's Anthony Devine, and he's the librarian at El Cajon Valley High School, which is just around the corner from my school.
Hi, everybody.
So all of this presentation was based on something that we did a while back in November at our local Q conference for San Diego. We did a presentation on lateral reading because it's kind of this thing that we knew kids needed to be doing it, but we had never actually seen anybody doing it. So we created a presentation. And we thought, oh, we'll do that at the Q conference as well. So we applied and we got the gig. It was really exciting. Next slide. However, since that time, a lot of things have changed. So much has changed. So our description may not exactly match what it is that we're going to be covering because we are actually going to be addressing a lot of the stuff that's going on right now in the news. Everything's been updated. Originally, we thought we'd update a few slides on fact checking. Nope, we updated a whole lot, like almost all the slides. So basically, in just a matter of weeks, the landscape has changed dramatically in terms of information. And in fact, even the World Health Organization has noted that there's so much information on the coronavirus, as an example, that they are calling it now an infodemic, which is a really serious issue. It's really difficult for people to make decisions about what sources they find trustworthy. And fake news about just this very issue is so profound right now that even in South Africa, it is against the law to spread any fake news about the coronavirus. Anyone who engages in that is liable for prosecution. They can be fined or even imprisoned. So it's actually for our own safety. So Suzanne took these pictures about 10 days ago, she was in line getting some supplies, and that's all everyone's talking about, right? Is the coronavirus. That's what's happening. Everywhere we go, this is what we're facing. And it's really relevant for what we're gonna be doing today. So in the chat right now, if you don't mind, could you just share like one piece of coronavirus misinformation that you may have overheard or seen from others? And Anthony is going to read and maybe share a couple of those.
We've got that it only affects old people. The US military brought it to China. It's just like the flu. It's a hoax by the Democrats. Oh, these are good examples.
They're great examples.
I'm young, so I don't have to worry about getting sick. Get it from toilet seats. And it goes on.
I haven't heard that one. That's a good one.
Don't let your dog lick your face.
Right. Which is just a good practice in general, right? Well, some questions to keep in mind as we go through this is just like keeping students in mind also is, as we evaluate online information, where do you get your news and other information? And then how do you determine what information to trust? So next we're going to be traveling back in time. So the CRAP test, and if you haven't heard of it, it is an industry standard for librarians. It's pretty much the method that students use to evaluate information. You can look it up and there are videos and songs and everything. The CRAP test is like a static kind of evaluation tool that asks you to kind of do a vertical analysis of a source. And this is what we've been doing for decades. It's like looking at the source, looking at the date, looking at who published the particular piece. But it's like I said, a vertical analysis, just looking at the piece itself. Maybe even looking at like the domain name, like the .org or the .com that may go along with it. But there are some weaknesses to the CRAP test. And next slide. That is, oh, it happened. That is that in November of 2016, the Stanford History Education Group just did a study, and they actually researched middle school students through undergraduate students, and they wanted to see like how successful they were at evaluating online information. And what they discovered in this study is that the students, all of them, struggled to distinguish ads from articles, neutral sources from biased ones, fake accounts from real ones. The study really pointed out that educators needed to teach students to move beyond the about section of a website and like the domain name, like the .org or the .edu, the date of publication. They needed to move beyond like this CRAP test. And instead they needed to start adopting the skills of fact checkers. That's a good idea. And that's when the term lateral reading really was coined, was back in the fall of 2016. So what is fact checking? And that's really that we did a presentation about fact checking at the time. We were like, oh, fact checking is the greatest thing. Basically, it's an entire industry. It's a job that's out there, but there's an international network of signatories. These are all examples of members of that particular international fact-checking network, which we refer to as IFCN. And they follow a strict code of principles. And in fact, if you find yourself with some free time, the Pointer Group is offering courses on the specific topic for free. And if you just click on that blue tab up in the blue box up in the upper right-hand corner, you have access to these free courses. They're available through May 31st. But what they discovered is that fact checkers actually do something called lateral reading. And so they did another study, the same group, the Stanford History Education Group, did another study about a year later in October of 2017. And what they did is they tested these middle school students, these college students and undergrad students. And then they also checked fact checkers and then historians for their, how did they behave? And they gave them this particular prompt, which was, they asked them to compare the websites of the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American College of Pediatrics and asked them, which one is a better source? And what happened is that fact checkers were 100% of the time, they chose the American Academy of Pediatrics as a more reliable source. Historians who are experts in their field, only 50% of them chose the American Academy of Pediatrics, and students were even more easily duped by the websites. What they discovered is that the students and the historians had a tendency to just look at the website itself, whereas fact checkers opened up additional tabs and began searching to verify the information in multiple tabs. So they were laterally reading across the tabs on their screen.
Okay, so right now, as Stephanie mentioned, we're dealing with the coronavirus, not only pandemic, but also infodemic. And so I had created this, if you click on it later, there's a whole set of Adobe Spark resources that are all about the infodemic and how to navigate through it. But while I was curating these resources, I used lateral reading skills myself, and I use them on a regular basis. They're just part of my habit right now. And that's what we want for students too, so that they automatically use these habits in order to evaluate information. So we're going to go through 3 examples of the lateral reading that I did when curating resources, so you can sort of get a better picture of lateral reading and what it looks like in practice. So the first example is I had found a site called NewsGuard, and they had information about a coronavirus misinformation tracking center. I had never heard of NewsGuard, and so in order to use lateral reading skills, I had to to research what NewsGuard is. And one site that I highly recommend that you use with students is Media Bias Fact Check. This is a site that actually goes through, and it will have especially news organization websites, but also some other websites. If you look it up and there is a hit, it will tell you where that particular organization fits in terms of bias. It'll talk about the accuracy of their reporting, whether or not they cite their sources. And this is a very quick tool for students to be able to use, especially as I'll be covering later. They don't have any kind of knowledge about the different websites that exist. They've maybe never heard of them. So what I found is that NewsGuard is actually one that is not that biased. It has a good amount of factual reporting and neutral wording, and so I was able to determine that it's probably a good source of information. Example 2, I had found this article from Stat News. Again, I had never heard of Stat News before. That Media Bias Fact Check source, though, that I just mentioned, where you can look up the publications or websites, it did not have Stat News in it. So that's why we're saying, you know, sometimes you will try one method and it won't work. So I'll have students who say like, oh, I looked up my site and it's not in there. Well, then you have to try another method. One that works very often and that's helpful is actually looking for the particular website or publication in Wikipedia. There's one trick where if you want a quick way, you can delete everything after the domain, so the .com, when you're up in the address bar, add a space and then the word Wikipedia, hit enter, and you can quickly do a search that usually brings the Wikipedia page up to the very top of the search results, or you can just go straight to Wikipedia and look up the website. So I was able to find Stat News in Wikipedia and was able to find out that it is like a health website, that it was launched by the owner of the Boston Globe. I could go on, and realize like, oh, this is probably another good legitimate source to include. And then my third example was that I was using Medium. Now Medium, if you're not familiar with it, there actually is a entry for it in Media Bias Fact Check. And if you were to look it up, what you'd find is that it actually has a mixed rating when it comes to factual reporting. And the reason why is because it's really just a blog host. So it's not so much that something is good or bad if it's in Medium, it comes down to who is posting the information there. So in this case, it was someone named Kate Starbird, and I also just added this. I had seen this come through today. There was a whole, if you click on this how bad is the worst case coronavirus scenario, there was like a Twitter like debate going on about this one particular Medium article, and so they actually even put this, added this little box above the article because there was so much controversy going on Twitter about it. So if you click on it, you can see the controversy. But anyway, going back to Kate Starbird, if you do a regular Google search for Kate Starbird, I was able to confirm that she is indeed part of the University of Washington faculty, that her specialty is in crisis informatics. And then if I clicked over in the Google search results on the news tab, I was also able to see that she is in fact somebody who people have been citing as an expert from a number of well-known publications. So hopefully those examples will give you an idea about what lateral reading maybe looks like in practice. For the remainder of our presentation, we're actually going to be addressing 3 other ideas. Rather than going through detail about how, like, all the nitty-gritty steps of using lateral reading, we will show you resources that will tell you step by step how to do those. So the 3 areas we are going to focus on, though, is why is information evaluation so hard? How can students translate skills that they already do have, and what resources are out there? So we're going to go ahead and get started with what makes information evaluation so difficult. One of the ideas that has really stuck with us, the librarians, when we've been talking for the last 4 years, is when we heard the concept of container collapse. And the first time that I had ever read it was from another library person, Joyce Valenza, and her name is linked to the article where that comes from. And she really made it clear why some of us who are from an older generation may not understand how younger people don't distinguish between different types of information that we do, because when we were maybe used to reading news in a newspaper or magazines in a physical magazine, we used to have these physical cues that would let us know the type of information that we are looking at. And I know even now I can still just picture these when I think that I'm looking at one of these different types of sources. For students, from the time that they've been born, all of the information has been packaged and delivered digitally through either a computer screen, or even more commonly now through a tablet or a smartphone. Another thing that makes information evaluation look difficult, besides the fact that it looks the same when you have it on a screen, is that when they are accessing any particular type of information, it's also completely contextless. What we mean by this is like, okay, maybe they get the idea that they're looking at news. I don't have a picture of like a paper newspaper, but there was always like the front page section, and then there'd be the local section, the business section, the sports section. And you do see that websites like This Is Our Local Newspaper, they have attempted to mirror that format in their navigation. So they have the news section, the sports section, the business section. But really, students, or even I myself, rarely go directly to a news website and then go and click through those sections like we might browse through different sections of a paper newspaper. Instead, we are much more likely to access links and news that are shared through social media, perhaps. And so trying to keep this in mind, like these are just like 4 continuous tweets that I just randomly picked off of the Union Tribune. You can see it went from something that was a top story, that to a sports story, to a national story, to a human interest story. All of those content from these different sections are just being meshed together. And even if they try to give some clues, like you can see they're attempting, like, oh, we're trying to call this an opinion story here that people will notice. One, students don't usually even notice or know what it means if they see those things in brackets. But more importantly, they're also not likely following the social media for these different news organizations. When they're getting their links, it's probably because a friend has shared it, a family member has shared it. And so they really are just dropped into the source without any kind of clue of context. So we're going to do a quick few rounds. This will be our first round of what do you know? We'll attempt for people to answer in the chat. We'll give you some time, but you can also just think of what your score is in your head. So give yourself 1 point, and there are 10 points possible because there are 10 things listed for every name or title that you know. And you can type it in the chat or just think it to yourself. We'll look at a few of the responses. So even with the few that have come back, I see 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 1, 6, a lot of 8s, 10s, 9s. My guess is that you are probably going to score really high. As an adult, these are types of websites or organizations that we are familiar hearing about. Now, the catch is I generated this list because when working with students and them doing research and evaluating sources, these are all titles that stood out to me because they made some comment that they had never ever heard of these. So that's why you have to imagine that we are dealing with students when they access this website and you say like, oh, this is an article from The Guardian or Newsweek or NPR. They have no idea what that even means. And so this leads me to a quote that I read in the past and still sticks with me, and it's the kind of the key to what makes information evaluation so hard. How do we identify experts if we are not experts ourselves? So how can students even tell whether they should trust information if they've never heard of any of those sources? And so the key is not only to have more content knowledge, but better meta knowledge. And really, lateral reading is helping students very quickly build better meta knowledge about the sources that they are attempting to evaluate. So this is kind of a disturbing statistic when I was looking up stuff about coronavirus. And it just shows that even if we are trying to point people to credible sources at some times, there are very likely to go to not necessarily the most reputable. The only silver lining is that this was published at the end of February, before coronavirus really got big in the news. But what it found is that there were 2.1 million engagements over 90 days with Zero Hedge, which was spreading misinformation about coronavirus. In contrast, CDC during that same time period only had 175 engagements, and the World Health Organization only had 25,000 engagements. The good news, though, is that hopefully through some of the efforts that people are making to point people to credible resources, for instance, Google has created like an SOS alert where they are prioritizing information about coronavirus when people do a search about it. Or you'll probably notice if you're on any social media site, they are highlighting specific sources and curating the ones that we see first. And so I did add this one picture here. This was from social media I saw this morning, where the World Health Organization got 4 million followers that they were celebrating. And that made me happy too, because after seeing that statistic from the previous slide, I'm thinking hopefully now people are starting to look at some more reputable sources. One way that we as teachers can really help students who lack all of that meta knowledge about the different information sources is to really do explicit direct instruction. And so I created this presentation to do a quick lesson with students. This was right before we had left, the week before we left, actually, before the quarantine went in place. So the whole thing was teaching students what exactly news is. And if you click on it, you can see the whole slide deck if you're interested in going through it later. The other thing I do want to point out is that I was building a lot off of the resources from the Stony Brook University Center for News Literacy. So if you are looking for any type of resources about news literacy, I highly recommend checking them out. They were one of the most helpful. But we're going to go ahead and say, like, even if students don't know that much about news, how much do we know? So second round of what do you know? Again, there are 10 points possible, and you can put your score in the chat. How many of these 10 things have you ever heard of, or which of these do you know? So I see big 0, 3, 0, 2, 0, 4, 1. Some got higher with 5, but a lot of people are less than 5. These are all terms that you can find out more about later. They're hyperlinked, the answers here on the next slide. They are all terms related to information and news and how the new information landscape is working and the different techniques that people use. And so really, this is just meant to show that we ourselves as adults have to stay really humble as learners, that there's so much changing when it comes to information that we need to be constantly learning and keeping track of the new trends and what's happening so that we can also help make our students aware of those. So one example, for instance, is advertorial that's listed here. Going back to the SHEG study that Stephanie had mentioned earlier, one of the stats was that 82% of middle schoolers couldn't distinguish between an ad labeled sponsored content and a real news story. Really though, the way that advertorials are made now are so deceptive because they want their ads to just perfectly blend in to the layout of whatever publication that they're in. And this is actually from advertising agency or organization who are trying to promote their services, and they're saying, why should you do this? And to sell their services because it works. And it really does work not only with students but ourselves too. How often maybe we don't realize that content that we're looking at is paid for. And so when this is a slide from like the Stony Brook news curriculum where we talk about actually thinking of the different types of information and that they're not all the same. So there are these information neighborhoods. So you could say like, oh yes, there's journalism and news, there's entertainment, there's advertising. The problem is though, when we just had the example of advertorials, these categories are really getting mashed up. And so it's not so easy to tell where you are, what information neighborhood you are in. Okay, so then for the last part of the section, we'll do one more round. Depending on your answer, you may have different interests than me, or you just know kids a lot. What do you know? Give yourself a score. How many of these 10 things do you know? Wow, I saw someone who had a 4. That's pretty good. Lots of zeros. A 1. Lots of zeros. Okay, well, these are all things that I had never heard of either. But in either talking to my students or talking to my children, I heard these names, and a lot of them I had to actually ask for them to repeat them and spell them out for me because I had no idea what they were talking about. I had a student say, oh yeah, my favorite YouTuber, because these are all YouTubers, is Jacksepticeye. And it's like, what the heck are you even talking about? So the answers are all linked on the next slide too if you are interested in looking them up. There are some from a lot of these are gamers. Some of these are from my daughter. She's really into contortionism, actually. And then the last 2 on these 10 are the 2 of the top 3 most subscribed YouTube channels that there are out there. I had a big group of students that just started laughing really loud at one point in the library. And so I had asked them, just went over, I'm like, oh, what's going on? What's so funny? And they were looking at their screens and they were doing Google searches to find the populations of countries. And what I ended up finding out is that they were trying to find out which countries' populations were equivalent to the subscription rates of their favorite YouTube channels. And so I thought that was pretty genius actually, and hilarious that they were doing something so nerdy. So these top YouTubers, for instance, Coco Melon's the number 3, it's a kids YouTube station, is equivalent to the population of Thailand, which is the 20th most populous country, and then T-Series, which is the number 1 YouTube subscribed channel, has equivalent to the population of Mexico, which is the number 10th most populous country. So some of those other channels that are not nearly in the top 3, but still popular, I have their equivalent populations to countries here. But what I really do want to point out is some interesting things to consider. One, that Denver guy who is a popular, but not as popular as the other, Fortnite channel, has 9, and this is as of, I just updated it on March 10th, has 997,000 subscribers. And that number is actually basically double what the Atlantic circulation is, way more than what the Guardian has. And that makes me really feel for the Guardian every time I see their ads pop up when I look at their web news. The National Review, I had that example of how my students had never heard of Newsweek. Well, it's no wonder they only had 100,000 subscribers in 2015, and now I don't even know if they have it in print anymore. If you go to some of the more popular though video game YouTubers, Jacksepticeye and Markiplier, their personal individual earnings in 1 year, and this was a stat I got from 2017 to 2018, was basically equivalent, and that's just them as individuals, to NPR's net income. And so something that we really need to consider is we can say like, oh yeah, these kids, they just live in their own little information worlds. I'm not really worried about it. I want them to learn about the worlds that the academic world and the news world and things that I consider to be important. But really, we have to start thinking about the fact that their worlds are even bigger than the ones that we're part of a lot of times. And that leads to Stephanie talking about what skills and information worlds that students do live in.
So she just got finished talking about like, why is the information evaluation so hard? And now we're going to be talking about how can students translate skills that they already have to be able to do what we call lateral reading. So and basically, what are students doing when they're online? These are their most popular platforms that they really enjoy. But one thing that holds them all together is the fact that they are visual or video based. And so students have skills when it comes to visuals and videos, but not necessarily with the print world, the digital print world in particular. So ask your students when they are looking at these particular websites, particularly with YouTube, is like, ask them what judgments do they make when they're deciding, like, why do they like a certain channel? How are they better than ones with similar content? And do they trust what they share? Like, do they trust what is shared on those particular channels? How do they build meta knowledge online? Well, they watch a ton of videos about their topic of interest. They scour the search results. They've checked out the recommended and related videos. They read all of the comments. They have a very developed, nuanced judgment when it comes to those videos. In fact, it's more sophisticated than most adults as they go through, because there's so much in all of the videos. Questions for you to keep in mind, or for us to keep in mind, is like, what do we know about the information that they access? And how can we use lateral reading to build meta knowledge about their worlds? So it's like kind of flipping it back on us. If we flip it back and start looking at, well, how do they do it? It will help us to understand how to reach them. And so basically, like, how do you judge the videos that they enjoy without watching all of them? Because I certainly don't have enough time, honestly, to watch them all.
And I asked my daughter to share her favorite video, or YouTube channels and videos, and these are what she shared, and I definitely do not want to watch them all. I can't even barely stand watching one.
But it is really important for us to pay attention, because we do need to guide them as these are in their personal interests. And I'll just bring up the point of PewDiePie, who, on a surface level, I've popped in and watched several of PewDiePie's video, and I have in the past with my kids, and he was charming. He was walking in like high heels and he was funny. But there, if you really dig deep, there are some problematic issues that are involved in his particular website or in his channel. And also Dylan Roof and the story of Dylan Roof and how he was radicalized on the internet it's really a problem. So we as educators need to pay attention. We need to stay involved, because we can't reach them unless that we can speak to them specifically in the realms where they are fluent. And that's really in video and visual literacy. So here's an example that I use when I'm talking to students about evaluating material online and how they can transfer their skills over. I always use Instagram, because everyone uses it and it's really easy. And basically I ask them, okay, so you're going to look at a new account and you're deciding whether or not you want to follow that particular account. But what do you look at when you're making that particular judgment? And we talk about, well, who does that account follow and how many people follow it? Who follows that particular account and how many people follow that? Who's tagged in posts? What are the hashtags that are there? Like, who likes it? Who comments on it? What are all the comments that are there? And when I do this, when I ask them about this and all their behaviors, they get all uncomfortable and giggly, and they basically call themselves Instagram stalkers. They're very quick to identify themselves, and they get kind of embarrassed, but I tell them that's exactly what I want you to do. I want you to do some good old Instagram stalking, but I want you to apply that into a digital world. It's just like lateral reading. We want our students to build a meta knowledge on topics that they study in school so that they can place that information in a greater context, just like they do on Instagram, just like they do in YouTube. So basically, what resources are out there? This is the third part of the presentation. And what can you use? And the thing is, when we did our presentation back in November of 2019, the resources weren't available yet. And now there are some great resources that you can use. And we could go through and identify all the different techniques, but there's great stuff that really does it even clearer in a more polished way with robust resources available. So the first one is the four pillars of MediaWise. And and that Stanford History Education Group, they developed an entire website based on that research that they did called Civic Online Reasoning. And you can click on it. This video here gives a big overview of what the program is, and it's robust, it's clean, it's really nice. And I'll talk about it in a little bit more. Pointer also offers in-person teaching opportunities to learn more about this. Pointer also offers a teen fact-checking network. That's where teens work as fact checkers. That's creating a habit of mind that we really want to see in students. And then their fourth area is they have ambassadors who are kind of promoting these habits of mind as well. And that includes people like John Green, who's navigating the digital information crash courses included, Lester Holt, Tyler Oakley. So these ambassadors are influencers who hopefully will be helping young people to kind of see the world in a different way. So the Stanford History Education's Civic Online Reasoning class was just launched this fall, right after we did our presentation. This is the launch page for it. And it's organized essentially around three main questions. Who's behind the information? What's the evidence? And then what do other sources say? And you can see the launch pages or the, for each of the three questions here. And you can see like there are four main categories, and it's also in two different levels. So at least I looked at the high school information. So there's stuff that's good for 9th and 10th grade, and then the other materials better for 11th and 12th grade, which was, I thought, really helpful. I do want you to bear in mind as you go through this particular material that the Civic Online Reasoning program is really teacher-centered, meaning it needs a teacher to guide students through. They could not go on here themselves and like click through and do it independently. It's great material, but it does require a teacher's intervention.
Yes, and as Stephanie was saying with that, you do have to create a login, but it's absolutely free. And these are really more like lesson plans, and they do have videos that you can also assign from there. But as she said, it just launched in this past fall. And so we're going to travel back in time one more time. I first learned about the lateral reading, the concept of lateral reading. We were saying back in 2016, late 2016. And at that time, I looked around to see what resources existed since they were saying this is what we should be teaching. I was looking for those resources. They did not exist. All that I could find were little bits and pieces of advice that were in a variety of blog posts and news articles, and I took bits and pieces from all of those and created my own method, which I at that point called WAC. And I was saying that students should find out and investigate the authority at the website level, the author level, the article level, and the claims level. There are so many resources out there that this might be a little bit not necessary for you, but it is linked. There's a Google site, and then there's also like a Google Doc lesson that we had sent out in Google Classroom when we used this in the past. And so you're more than welcome to take a look at that because it's something that might be perhaps just easy to deliver, especially if you're working remotely with students right now. The Google Doc, I will say, it was having them go through all of those steps of doing all 4 levels of investigation about a single source, and it took a couple of days in the end. That's way, way, way more than we want them to do when they're just coming across information, especially if they're doing it just in their informal lives, when they're just seeing it in their newsfeed. They're not going to do that. And the best feedback I got from students when I asked about the lesson and evaluating it, they said, I probably wouldn't use it if I'm lazy. Well, that's the truth about all of us. We're not going to go through all of those steps. So really, what the real in practice lateral reading skills are is that we develop a heuristic approach. This is a term that is used by Mike Caulfield, who I'll be showing in the next slide, but it's really just developing practical methods. They may not be exactly perfect, but they are just logical, practical steps that we can take and add to our habits. So Mike Caulfield, who I mentioned, he created a different method. So his method, and you might see this around online, is the SIFT method. And he said it's 4 moves, and they are stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. So if you are keeping track of, now we had civic online reasoning, the WAC method that I used, and then we had SIFT. And SIFT came out after I had, that was also not around back when I had done WAC, but I found it later. So this table kind of shows that they're all 3 methods are really doing the same thing. And so they line up in the rows. The only place where there is a gap in the civic online reasoning and the WAC method was stop. And stop may seem like, oh, it's just a step we can skip, because it's really not an action at all to just stop. It's a lack of action, if anything. But I think it's really important that you consider that step. And that's because it relates to which of these 5 core concepts of media literacy. If you take a real quick look, all media messages are constructed. Media messages are constructed using a creative language. The different people experience the same media message differently. That's the one. When we think about information, a lot of times we're asking students to just judge the information that they're looking at, but really we're asking them to also self-reflect and think about their part in interacting with the information. And the really key parts that comes to how they are experiencing media differently is cognitive biases. So if you have heard of if you haven't heard of cognitive biases, there are links so that you can get more information about them. Confirmation bias is probably the one that's most popular that people have heard about when it comes to fake news, the idea that we just seek out things that confirm what we already want to believe. And so I do think stop is important, especially right now. I read things and I have built the practice of noticing that makes me feel really emotional. Let me stop and think about why that is, or what is it about this piece of information that's causing this reaction in me, and why maybe are they crafting their message in the way to get that response. So even though we were saying the civic online reasoning is great, it may not be ready to deliver without the teacher involvement. If you do want some standalone content that you could have students just go through on their own, Mike Caulfield does have the Check Please starter course. I have gone and done the whole entire course on my own. He actually allows you to make copies of it, but you can also just link them to it, and it's something that you can just click through. It has like stopping points where you can question yourself and go through exercises. Although he developed this for the university level, an intro level college course, it could easily be used at the high school level as well. And Mike Caulfield also has applied SIFT to the particular coronavirus pandemic, and he has all of those resources available also. Infodemic.blog. At infodemic.blog, he has a Twitter account just for the infodemic blog. And again, this is something that you can just deliver a link and have people just go through on their own. So we wanted to make sure we left time for questions at the end. I know maybe Anthony, if you saw questions that came through, you can bring them to our attention. Stephanie and I are available anytime, also through social media or email if you want to ask for more questions. But really, if you have the slide deck and the link was on all of the pages, just make sure you click all over the slides, because whenever it was possible, we have hyperlinked to the information that is shown on the slides.
And we do have time if anybody does have questions. The session isn't technically over for a little bit. So if you want to unmute your mic and just ask, we're here for you. And honestly, super happy that so many people came. Thank you for listening.
I did see some people who mentioned in the chat they have used, like Sarah mentioned she used the SIFT method. I don't know if you have any advice about how things went when you taught it with your students.
No.
No?
can't unmute. Can you unmute them,
Oh,
Suzanne?
I'll
She
look
can't
for
because it's loud where she is, she says.
Oh, thank you, Anthony. Sorry.
Well, we will not have people stay on longer if necessarily. The bit.ly should be there as long as it's working. You're more than welcome to copy and use. Anything that we create, we're always happy for anybody to use.
We are sharers. We just like sharing.
And we want students all over to hopefully get the access to these skills.
Yeah, and I've used Suzanne's WAC website with my students, and it is overwhelming because there's so many layers for evaluation. We do recommend that you break that up like by grade level or something where they don't have to do it every time. They can do part of it some of the time. It's really helpful though.
And that's a good point for all of these things that we're learning about right now. You don't have to teach all of them in one lesson or one big unit. You can break these up, just work them into your instruction over time.
Well, thank you, everybody. And you have our contact information.
Oh,
Thank you.
Well, we mentioned that the Pointer Institute, there was a link.
it's on.
Oh,
There
here,
it is.
with the fact-checking network. Because Pointer is actually the group that they oversee the whole international fact-checking network. They have a number of resources on how to do fact-checking, but they have a lot of resources right now on where you can do free courses. And then the other curriculum that I had mentioned is from the Stony Brook University. That's always free. And they actually have entry points for teachers and for students so that it's delivered a little bit differently on their website. And then
Mike Caulfield's stuff is also free and available. And then the Stanford History Education groups.
Theirs is free always.
Always free as well.
Okay.
Well, alrighty, friends. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here.